A blood-stained confession letter surfaced in Charleston County, South Carolina, in 1847, hidden inside the walls of a demolished plantation manor. The document, written in two distinct handwritings, detailed the murder of an enslaved woman named Patience and the systematic cover-up that followed. What made authorities seal the case file for 70 years wasn't just the brutality described, but the identity of the second writer, a child no older than 8, whose testimony contradicted every official record. The Charleston Historical Society refused to comment on the letter's authenticity until 1923, citing matters of civic reputation. Tonight, we reveal what that little girl saw in the barn on August 14, 1834, and why the truth was buried deeper than any grave. Before we continue with the story of Magnolia Ridge Plantation, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this, the ones they tried to erase from history, need to be told. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where my audience is discovering these dark chapters of American history. The documents we're about to discuss were only declassified after the last living descendant of the Rutledge family died without heirs, releasing their private papers to the state archives. Magnolia Ridge sat 12 miles inland from Charleston, far enough from the coastal humidity to grow decent tobacco, but close enough to the port for profitable export. In 1834, it was one of 43 plantations operating in the county, neither the largest nor the smallest, employing 62 enslaved people across 400 acres. The manor house, built in 1809, featured the fashionable Greek Revival columns that every ambitious planter wanted, white paint that blistered under the relentless sun, and a reputation for stability that made it unremarkable among its peers. Samuel Rutledge inherited the property from his father in 1828 at age 31. Unlike some of the more flamboyant planters who spent seasons in Charleston society, Samuel preferred the routine of agricultural management. He kept meticulous records, purchased quality breeding stock, and maintained what he called reasonable discipline among his workforce. His wife Catherine had died giving birth to their only son, Thomas, in 1830, leaving Samuel to raise the boy with help from his widowed sister Margaret, who moved into the manor that same year. The plantation operated under the conventional hierarchy of the time. An overseer named Dutch Calloway, hired from Georgia in 1832, managed the field hands. 2 house servants, elderly women named Bess and Clara, handled the cooking and cleaning. The rest worked the tobacco fields, their days measured by the relentless South Carolina sun and the overseer's bell. Among those 62 souls was Patience Drummond, 26 years old, who'd been born on the property. Records listed her as capable field hand, no known complications, but those who knew her remembered something else, a singing voice that carried across the fields during harvest, clear and haunting. She had a daughter, Ruby, born in 1826, whose father's name appeared nowhere in the plantation books. This wasn't unusual. Many such silences existed in those pages. Ruby worked in the manor house starting at age 6, learning basic household tasks under Bess's instruction. She was small for her age, quiet, with her mother's dark eyes, and a habit of watching everything with an intensity that made some uncomfortable. Samuel Rutledge had approved her transfer from fieldwork, noting in his ledger that the girl shows aptitude for domestic service and may prove valuable in that capacity. The summer of 1834 was particularly brutal. Temperatures climbed above 95 degrees for 18 consecutive days in July, and 2 elderly field workers died from what the plantation doctor called heat apoplexy. The tobacco crop suffered, leaves yellowing prematurely, and Dutch Calloway grew increasingly irritable, extending work hours and reducing water breaks. Tensions simmered across Magnolia Ridge, like the heat waves rising from the red clay. In the big house, 8-year-old Thomas Rutledge spent his days with a tutor imported from Charleston, learning Latin and mathematics while his father reviewed accounts in the study. The boy had his mother's fair coloring and his father's serious demeanor, already showing signs of the stern planter he was being groomed to become. Ruby saw him often during her duties. This other child, whose world existed in the same physical space as hers, yet remained impossibly distant. Margaret Rutledge, 38 years old, managed the household with firm efficiency. She'd never married, and gossip suggested a broken engagement in her youth, but she never spoke of it. Instead, she channeled her energies into making Magnolia Ridge a model of southern domesticity, at least within the manor's walls. She inspected Ruby's work with a critical eye, correcting the placement of silverware and the folding of linens, but never raised her voice, maintaining the cool courtesy that Charleston society demanded. The barn where everything would happen sat 200 yards behind the manor house, a substantial structure that housed workhorses, equipment, and served as storage for tools and seed. It was built of pine planked over oak framing, with a loft accessible by ladder where hay and other supplies were kept. Dutch Calloway maintained a small office in one corner, little more than a desk and chair, where he kept his records, and, according to later testimony, a bottle of whiskey hidden in a grain barrel. Patients had been assigned to evening barn duties that August, feeding and watering the horses after field work ended. This was lighter work than picking tobacco, and some speculated it was a kindness from Samuel Rutledge, though his ledgers mentioned only reassignment due to declining field productivity. She would arrive at dusk, spend an hour with the animals, then return to the slave quarters, a row of small cabins visible from the manor's second-floor windows. Life at Magnolia Ridge followed the patterns established over decades across the South. A carefully maintained hierarchy where everyone knew their place and the consequences of forgetting it. The work was hard, but predictable. The punishments harsh, but not unusually so by the standards of 1834. Samuel Rutledge considered himself a reasonable man, better than some of his neighbors, not as soft as others. He attended church on Sundays, paid his debts, and expected the same order from his household that he maintained in his ledgers. Nothing in those carefully ruled columns suggested that within days, blood would stain the barn floor. Nothing in the peaceful routine of morning bells and evening prayers indicated that a child would witness something that would haunt her for 70 years. The documents would show that Ruby was supposed to be asleep in the house servants' quarters that night. Instead, she'd gone looking for her mother. August 14th, 1834 began like any other Thursday at Magnolia Ridge. The sun rose at 5:47 a.m., and Dutch Calloway's bell rang 15 minutes later, summoning the field workers from their cabins. Patience. Drummond joined the line heading toward the tobacco fields, her daughter watching from the manor house kitchen window as Bess kneaded dough for the morning's biscuits. The temperature was already climbing toward what would be another scorching day. Ruby's duties that morning included helping Bess with breakfast service, polishing the silver in the dining room, and beating dust from the parlor rugs. She performed these tasks mechanically, her mind elsewhere. The night before, she'd overheard Dutch Calloway telling Samuel Rutledge that Patience had been slacking in her evening duties, leaving the barn before all tasks were completed. Ruby had seen her mother's exhaustion, the way she'd been moving slower lately, holding her side as if something hurt there. The day progressed in oppressive heat. By afternoon, 3 more field workers had collapsed, requiring the plantation doctor to be summoned from his rounds at a neighboring property. Samuel Rutledge paced his study, calculating the cost of lost labor against the value of potentially damaged workers. Dutch Calloway sent word that he was extending the workday by an hour to make up for lost time. The decision rippled through the slave quarters with silent dread. Patience returned from the fields at 7:30 p.m., her dress soaked through with sweat, red clay caked on her bare feet. Ruby saw her from the second-floor landing where she was dusting banisters, watched her mother pause at the well to drink deeply before heading toward the barn. There was something in Patience's posture, a heaviness beyond physical exhaustion, that made Ruby uneasy. What happened next, we know from multiple sources. The confession letter, testimony given 30 years later, and physical evidence documented when the barn was finally examined in 1847. The accounts don't always align perfectly, but certain facts remain undisputed. At approximately 8:15 p.m., as dusk settled over Magnolia Ridge, Ruby finished her duties and was sent to the servants' quarters to sleep. Instead, driven by worry she couldn't fully articulate, she circled back toward the barn. The sky had turned that particular purple-gray of southern twilight, and cicadas were beginning their evening chorus. She approached quietly, as enslaved children learned to move, making herself small and unobtrusive. The barn's main door stood partially open, and lamplight spilled from within. She could hear voices, two of them, one her mother's, pleading, and another that made her stomach clench with fear. Ruby crept to the side of the barn where gaps between the planks allowed slivers of vision. What she saw would be described in her own handwriting 40 years later, when arthritis had twisted her fingers but not erased her memory. Inside the barn, Patience stood near the horse stalls, backed against the wall. Dutch Calloway faced her, blocking the door. His voice was slurred, the whiskey bottle visible on his makeshift desk. He was speaking about her disrespect, about teaching a lesson, about things Ruby was too young to fully understand but old enough to fear. Patience was trying to talk her way out, using the careful, deferential tone that survival demanded. "Mr. Calloway, sir, I done all the work you asked. The horses is fed and watered, the stalls is mucked, everything like you wanted. You questioning me?" His voice rose. "You saying I'm a liar?" "No, sir, I ain't saying nothing like that, I just—" The first blow came fast, his fist connecting with Patience's jaw, with a sound Ruby would hear in nightmares for the rest of her life. Her mother stumbled, tried to catch herself on the stall door, and Calloway hit her again, this time in the ribs. Ruby's child mind screamed at her to run, to get help, to do something, but she was frozen, small fingers gripping the rough barn wood, unable to look away or move forward. She watched her mother fall, watched Calloway kick her once, twice, watched Patience try to curl into herself for protection. Then came the moment that would define everything that followed. Samuel Rutledge appeared in the barn doorway. For one crystalline instant, Ruby thought salvation had arrived. The master would stop this. He would protect her mother. That's what the carefully maintained myth of paternalistic plantation management promised, wasn't it? That masters were cruel but just, harsh but protective of their property. Samuel Rutledge stood in that doorway for perhaps 5 seconds, taking in the scene. His overseer, drunk and violent. His enslaved worker bleeding on the barn floor. His niece's words from dinner echoed in that space. "You're too soft with them, uncle. Father always said discipline maintains order." What Ruby saw in his face wasn't anger at Calloway. It was calculation. "She attacked you," Samuel Rutledge said. It wasn't a question. It was an instruction. Dutch Calloway, breathing hard, seemed to understand immediately. "Yes, sir. Came at me with a pitchfork. Had to defend myself." Patience tried to speak, blood bubbling from her lips. "No, Master Samuel, please, I never—" But Samuel Rutledge had already turned away, his decision made. "Do what's necessary to restore order, Mr. Calloway. I'll inform the house staff there was an incident. An unfortunate incident." He walked out of the barn, his boots crunching on the gravel path back toward the manor house. Dutch Calloway looked down at Patience, and something shifted in his expression. With the master's implicit permission, he no longer needed to restrain himself. Ruby watched her mother die. The details are too brutal to recount in full, and the confession letter's second writer, the 8-year-old child Ruby, struggled to find words for what she witnessed. She wrote of sounds, the wet crack of something breaking inside, of her mother's singing voice reduced to gasping whimpers, of the barn cats fleeing from the smell of blood. She wrote of standing paralyzed by horror and the knowledge that screaming would mean her own death. When it was over, when Patience Drummond's body lay still in the blood-soaked straw, Dutch Calloway stood over her, breathing hard. He took a long drink from his whiskey bottle. Then he looked directly at the gap in the barn wall where Ruby's eye had been pressed. "I see you, girl." Ruby ran. She ran through the darkening plantation grounds, past the slave quarters where people had learned not to hear screaming, past the well where her mother had taken her last drink of water, toward the only refuge an 8-year-old enslaved child could imagine. The big house where Master Thomas slept, where Aunt Margaret maintained order, where surely someone would help. She stumbled through the kitchen door, where Bess was banking the fires for the night. The old woman's face went pale as Ruby burst in, covered in barn dust and terror. "Child, what?" "Master killed my mama in the barn." The words tumbled out, truth unfiltered by strategy or survival instinct. "Master Samuel was there, and he told Mr. Calloway to do it, and my mama's dead, and he saw me watching, and—" Bess's hand clamped over Ruby's mouth, cutting off the flood of words. For a moment the two of them stood frozen in the kitchen's residual heat, the old woman's eyes full of a fear that mirrored Ruby's own. "You listen to me," Bess whispered, her voice shaking. "You don't say them words again, you hear me? Not ever, not if you want to live to see morning." But it was too late. Samuel Rutledge stood in the kitchen doorway, Margaret beside him, both having heard every word. Thomas in his nightshirt peered around his aunt's skirts, curious about the commotion. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. Samuel Rutledge's face was unreadable, the same expression he wore when reviewing accounts or calculating crop yields. He was solving a problem, Ruby realized with the clarity of absolute terror. She was a problem that needed solving. "The child is hysterical," he said finally, addressing Margaret. "She's had a shock. Her mother suffered an accident in the barn, resisted discipline and met with tragedy. The overseer was defending himself against assault. Tragic, but necessary. The girl, however—" He looked at Ruby with eyes that held no warmth, no mercy, only cold assessment. "The girl is making dangerous accusations." Margaret Rutledge's hand tightened on her nephew Thomas's shoulder. "What are you suggesting, Samuel?" "She saw nothing. She understands nothing. She'll be locked in the cellar tonight while we determine what's to be done." He turned to Bess. "Take her down. Don't let her speak to anyone." As Bess's trembling hands pulled Ruby toward the cellar stairs, the child began to scream, the sound that had been trapped in her throat since watching her mother's murder finally erupting. She screamed her mother's name, screamed the truth, screamed accusations that would have gotten any adult enslaved person killed immediately. Thomas Rutledge, 8 years old and sheltered from the plantation's brutal realities, asked the question that would haunt him for decades. "Aunt Margaret, why is Ruby crying? Where's her mama?" Margaret's response was cut off as Bess dragged Ruby down into the darkness of the cellar, a stone-walled space that smelled of earth and potatoes, where the child's screams would be muffled by thick walls and the willful deafness of everyone who heard them. Above in the barn, Dutch Calloway was cleaning up the evidence of what he would forever claim was self-defense against a violent enslaved woman. The pitchfork he placed near Patience's body had never been touched by her hands. The marks on his own face, which he carefully inflicted on himself, would corroborate his story. And in his study, Samuel Rutledge dipped his pen in ink and began writing the official account in his plantation ledger. August 14th, 1834. Enslaved woman Patience Drummond, age 26, killed while attacking overseer Dutch Calloway with farming implement. Necessary force employed to subdue aggressor. Daughter Ruby, aged 8, witnessed aftermath and became hysterical. Matter resolved according to law. Total property loss, 1 field hand, valued at $600. The numbers didn't lie, Samuel Rutledge believed. Numbers were clean, orderly, free from the messy complications of truth. In the cellar, Ruby Drummond huddled in the darkness and understood, with the terrible wisdom of traumatized children, that she had just learned what her life was worth. Morning light filtered weakly through the cellar's single high window when Bess returned, carrying a tin cup of water and a piece of cornbread. Ruby hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, kept seeing her mother's face in the darkness. The old woman's hands shook as she set down the meager breakfast. "Child, you listen careful now," Bess whispered, glancing nervously toward the cellar stairs. "Master Samuel's called for the magistrate. Says there needs to be an official inquiry into what happened. Dutch Calloway done told his version already. Says your mama tried to kill him and he defended himself. Says you ain't seen nothing but the aftermath, that you're making up stories 'cause you're grieving. But I saw. It don't matter what you saw." Bess's voice cracked. "You 8 years old and enslaved. Judge ain't gonna believe nothing you say against a white overseer, and if you keep telling your story, if you keep saying Master Samuel was there." She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The magistrate, Judge Edmund Pritchard, arrived at 10 o'clock that morning, riding up the Oak Line Drive in his carriage. He was 56 years old, had presided over Charleston County for 18 years, and owned a small plantation of his own 20 miles south. He and Samuel Rutledge belonged to the same gentleman's club in Charleston, attended the same church, moved in the same social circles. The inquiry, such as it was, took place in Samuel Rutledge's study. Dutch Calloway presented his account first, standing with his hat in his hands, his face showing the scratches he'd inflicted on himself the night before. He spoke of Patience's insolent behavior, her refusal to complete assigned tasks, and finally her violent assault with a pitchfork when he confronted her about her defiance. "I feared for my life, Your Honor," Calloway said, his voice steady. "She came at me like a wild animal. I had no choice but to defend myself. It's a tragedy, truly, but a man has a right to protect himself." Judge Pritchard made notes in a leather-bound book. "Were there witnesses to this assault?" "The girl, Ruby, came to the barn after it was over. Found her mama dead and, well, she's a child. Can't rightly understand what happened. Been telling all sorts of wild stories, saying things that ain't true. Grief talking, I reckon." Samuel Rutledge corroborated the overseer's timeline, carefully omitting his own presence in the barn. "I heard a commotion, investigated afterward. Found Calloway shaken but unharmed and the woman deceased. The girl was hysterical, as Mr. Calloway said, making accusations that are simply impossible. And these accusations are—" Samuel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She claims I was present during the incident and somehow complicit. The ravings of a traumatized child, nothing more. I was in my study reviewing accounts at the time in question. My sister can verify this." Margaret Rutledge, called to testify, confirmed her brother's alibi without meeting Judge Pritchard's eyes. "Samuel was indeed in his study. I brought him tea at 8 o'clock and saw him working there. I heard nothing unusual until the girl came running into the house screaming about her mother." The judge closed his notebook. "I see no reason to pursue this matter further. A tragic incident of justified force against violent resistance. Mr. Calloway acted within his rights as overseer. The enslaved woman's death, while regrettable, appears lawful." He looked at Samuel. "The girl will need to be managed carefully. Such accusations, even from a child, can be problematic. She'll be dealt with appropriately," Samuel assured him. Ruby, still locked in the cellar, was never called to give testimony. In the legal framework of 1834 South Carolina, her words had no weight, no validity, no power to contradict the narrative that had been so carefully constructed. But someone else had heard her screams the night before. Thomas Rutledge, the 8-year-old heir to Magnolia Ridge, couldn't forget Ruby's voice crying out her accusations. The boy had been raised to accept the social order of plantation life as natural and divinely ordained. But something about Ruby's terror had disturbed him deeply. She was close to his own age, someone he'd seen nearly every day of his life, and now she was locked in the cellar like a criminal. That afternoon, while his father met with Judge Pritchard and his aunt supervised the preparation of Patience's body for burial in the slave cemetery, Thomas slipped down to the cellar. Ruby sat in the corner, hugging her knees, tear tracks dried on her dusty face. She looked up as lamplight preceded the boy down the stairs, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Two children divided by everything their society considered immutable. "Did you really see what happened?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruby's first instinct was to deny everything, to recant, to say whatever would keep her alive. But looking at Thomas's face, so similar to her own in its youth and confusion, something broke inside her. She told him the truth. Every detail. Her mother's pleas, Dutch Calloway's violence, and most damning of all, Samuel Rutledge's moment of choice in the barn doorway. Thomas listened in growing horror. But father wouldn't. He's always saying we have responsibilities to our people, that we treat them fairly. Your father watched my mama die, Ruby said, her voice hollow. And then he walked away. The boy's face went pale. He opened his mouth to protest, to defend his father. But the words wouldn't come. Because some part of him, the part that hadn't yet been fully molded by the system he'd inherit, recognized truth when he heard it. I have to go, he said finally, backing toward the stairs. If they catch me here... Master Thomas, Ruby called after him, using the title that reinforced the gulf between them, even as she sought his help. Please, they're gonna sell me, or worse, don't let them. Please. Thomas fled up the stairs without answering, but Ruby's plea haunted him. That night, he did something that would eventually lead to the confession letter's discovery 113 years later. He began keeping a secret journal, recording everything he'd heard and witnessed. His child's handwriting documenting truths that the official records would erase. Patience Drummond was buried the next day in an unmarked grave in the slave cemetery, a plot of land beyond the tobacco fields where the plantation's enslaved workers rested without headstones or ceremony. The burial was quick, perfunctory. Samuel Rutledge did not attend, but he did note the expense of lost work time in his ledger. Ruby remained in the cellar for 3 more days while her fate was decided. Samuel Rutledge consulted with other planters about how to handle an enslaved child who had witnessed something she shouldn't have, and worse, had spoken about it. The consensus was troubling. Such a witness was dangerous, her very existence a threat to the carefully maintained order. Several options were discussed. Selling her would simply move the problem elsewhere, and her story might spread. Harsh punishment might silence her, but could also make her a martyr among the other enslaved workers. What was needed, the planters agreed, was a solution that would be both effective and maintain the facade of benevolent paternalism. Margaret Rutledge provided the answer. On the 4th day of Ruby's imprisonment, Margaret descended the cellar stairs carrying a clean dress and a wash basin. She set them down and regarded the child with an expression that was neither cruel nor kind, simply pragmatic. You'll be staying in the house permanently now, Margaret announced. You'll have a small room off the kitchen better than the quarters. Your duties will increase, but so will your privileges. Better food, warmer shelter. But there are conditions. Ruby said nothing, understanding that no response was expected. You will never speak of what you think you saw in that barn. Not to the other servants, not to visiting guests, not to anyone. Not. If you do, you'll be sold to a plantation in Georgia where they work rice fields in snake-infested swamps, and you'll be dead within a year. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. More than that, Margaret continued, her voice dropping lower. You will actively support the official version of events. If anyone asks, you arrived after the incident. You saw your mother's body and assumed wrongly that something improper had occurred. Your grief made you irrational. You understand now that Mr. Calloway acted in self-defense. Can you say that? Ruby's mouth went dry. To survive, she would have to become complicit in her mother's murder, would have to speak words that betrayed Patience's memory. But what choice did an 8-year-old enslaved child have? I can say that, she whispered. Good. Then we understand each other. Margaret turned to leave but paused at the stairs. Your mother's death was unfortunate, but order must be maintained. You're intelligent enough to understand that, I think. Intelligence can be a curse or a gift, Ruby. The choice of which it becomes is yours. The room off the kitchen where Ruby was installed measured perhaps 8 feet by 6, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a small trunk for her belongings. But it had a door that closed, a window that opened, and most importantly, it was in the main house under Margaret Rutledge's direct supervision. Ruby would be watched constantly, her every word monitored, her every action scrutinized. Life at Magnolia Ridge returned to its routines. The tobacco was harvested. Dutch Calloway continued as overseer, his authority unchallenged. Judge Pritchard's official report declared the matter closed, and Ruby Drummond, 8 years old and orphaned, learned to perform her new role, the grateful enslaved child who had been shown mercy after false accusations born of grief. But late at night, in that small room off the kitchen, Ruby would press her ear to the wall and listen to the house settling, to Margaret's footsteps above, to Samuel Rutledge's voice discussing business matters with visitors. She listened and she remembered, storing every detail in a memory that would prove more permanent than the official records. And in his room on the second floor, Thomas Rutledge continued his secret journal, writing in a child's hand about the night Ruby came screaming into the house, about the story she'd told him in the cellar, about the doubt that had taken root in his heart regarding his father's character. The two children, separated by the vast gulf of their circumstances, were unknowingly documenting the truth that adults had worked so hard to bury. Years would pass before their written words would converge in that confession letter. Decades would elapse before anyone would read what they'd recorded. But the truth, once witnessed, is never truly destroyed. It simply waits. The silence that settled over Magnolia Ridge in the months following Patience's death was not peaceful. It was the silence of secrets carefully guarded, of questions deliberately unasked, of a community that had collectively agreed to look away from uncomfortable truths. Dutch Calloway grew bolder in his authority. With Samuel Rutledge's implicit endorsement of his actions, the overseer no longer felt the need for restraint. His drinking increased, and so did his violence toward the enslaved workers under his control. By December of 1834, 3 more people had died under circumstances officially attributed to accidents or natural causes, but which the slave quarters understood differently. Clara, one of the elderly house servants, found herself increasingly unable to keep quiet about what she sensed. Though she hadn't witnessed Patience's death, she'd known the woman for years, had helped raise Ruby, and understood that the official story didn't align with the Patience she'd known. One afternoon, while preparing dinner, with only Bess and Ruby present in the kitchen, Clara spoke carefully. "That pitchfork they said your mama grabbed," she said to Ruby, not looking up from the potatoes she was peeling. Patience was left-handed. Everybody knew that. But the pitchfork was found on the right side of her body. Funny thing that. Ruby, now 9 years old and hardened by months of enforced silence, said nothing. But she filed away the detail, adding it to the catalogue of discrepancies she was mentally compiling. Bess shot Clara a warning look. "Ain't our place to question what happened?" Judge said it was lawful. Judge said a lot of things that don't add up, Clara muttered, but she dropped the subject when Margaret Rutledge's footsteps sounded in the hallway. That winter was particularly harsh. Snow fell in Charleston, a rarity that the locals took as an ill omen. The tobacco crop had been poor, and Samuel Rutledge's financial situation grew precarious. He spent increasing amounts of time in Charleston, meeting with creditors and potential investors, leaving the plantation's daily operations to his sister and Dutch Calloway. During one of these absences, in February 1835, something happened that would later prove significant in unraveling the full scope of what had occurred on August 14th. A traveler appeared at Magnolia Ridge, a man named Jacob Winters, who identified himself as a journalist from Boston writing about agricultural practices in the South. Margaret Rutledge, adhering to Southern hospitality traditions, invited him to stay for dinner and spend the night. What she didn't know was that Winters was actually connected to the nascent abolitionist movement, traveling under false pretenses to document conditions on Southern plantations. Thomas Rutledge, now 9 years old, was allowed to dine with the adults that evening. Ruby served at table, her presence invisible in the way enslaved servants were trained to be. But she was listening, always listening, and what she heard that night gave her something she'd lost since her mother's death: hope. Winters spoke eloquently about moral philosophy. about questions of justice and human dignity. He was careful not to directly criticize slavery, knowing such commentary would get him ejected from the house, but his implications were clear to anyone paying attention. "I've heard disturbing accounts," Winters said, accepting a second helping of sweet potatoes from Ruby's serving dish, "of incidents on plantations being covered up by local authorities. Deaths ruled as accidents when evidence suggests otherwise. It seems the system rather protects itself, doesn't it?" Margaret's smile was glacial. "I'm sure such things occur on poorly managed properties. Here at Magnolia Ridge, we maintain proper order and treat our people well. Discipline when necessary, but never cruelty. I'm relieved to hear it. Although I understand there was a tragic incident here recently, an enslaved woman killed by your overseer." The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop. Margaret set down her fork with deliberate precision. "A matter of self-defense, fully investigated and resolved by the magistrate. The woman assaulted Mr. Calloway with a farming implement." "How terrible for all involved," Winters said, but his eyes had shifted to Ruby, standing motionless by the sideboard. "Was the woman's family compensated in any way?" "Compensated?" Margaret's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Winters, I think you may have spent too much time in Boston. The woman was property. One compensates an owner for property loss, not family members who are themselves property." "Of course. I forget sometimes the legal distinctions that apply here." He turned his attention to Thomas. "And you, young man, do you enjoy life on the plantation?" Thomas, who had been silent throughout the meal, struggled with his answer. In the months since Ruby's cellar confession, he'd become increasingly troubled by the contradictions between what he was taught about honorable Southern values and what he'd witnessed. His secret journal had grown to 50 pages, filled with observations that would horrify his father. "It's all I've known, sir," Thomas finally answered, the careful reply of a child who'd learned that honesty could be dangerous. After dinner, as Ruby cleared the dishes, Winters found a moment to speak to her alone in the hallway. His words were quick, barely above a whisper. "The woman who died, she was your mother, wasn't she?" Ruby's hands tightened on the serving platter. She glanced around nervously, aware that being caught in conversation with a guest could bring punishment. "Yes, sir." "Did it happen the way they said?" She looked into his eyes and saw something there, genuine concern, a willingness to hear truth. For a moment, she was tempted to tell him everything, to unburden herself to someone who might actually care. But survival instincts, honed over 6 months of enforced silence, prevailed. "It happened like they said, sir. My mama, she wasn't herself that day. The heat, maybe. She did something foolish and Mr. Calloway had to defend himself. I miss her terrible, but I understand now it wasn't nobody's fault but hers." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but they were the words that kept her alive. Winters studied her face, clearly recognizing the rehearsed quality of her response. "I see. Well, if you ever need to tell a different story, there are people in Charleston who would listen. The Society of Friends, they're called Quakers. They have a meeting house on King Street. They help people sometimes." Before Ruby could respond, Margaret Rutledge appeared in the hallway. "Ruby, take those dishes to the kitchen. Mr. Winters, perhaps you'd enjoy a brandy in the parlor." The moment passed, but the seed had been planted. There were people who might help, who might believe her. The knowledge was dangerous, but also sustaining. Winters left the next morning, but not before slipping a small card into Thomas's hand during breakfast. On it was written an address in Charleston and a single sentence: "Truth matters, even when it's dangerous." Thomas hid the card in his journal, another secret added to the growing collection. Spring arrived, and with it came changes to Magnolia Ridge that would set in motion the events leading to the confession letter's creation. Samuel Rutledge's financial troubles deepened. The previous year's poor tobacco harvest, combined with falling prices and mounting debts, forced him to consider selling portions of his enslaved workforce. The prospect terrified everyone in the slave quarters as families faced potential separation. In April 1835, a cotton broker from Georgia named Vernon Tisdale visited the plantation to assess which workers might be sold. He was a hard man with calculating eyes, known for purchasing enslaved people in bulk and transporting them to the expanding cotton plantations in the Deep South, where mortality rates were significantly higher than in the Upper South. Dutch Calloway escorted Tisdale through the quarters, presenting workers like livestock at auction. Ruby watched from the kitchen window as men and women were examined, their teeth checked, their muscles assessed, their value calculated. The overseer was clearly relishing his role, making recommendations based on productivity and temperament. When they approached the house, Margaret called Ruby into the parlor where Tisdale was reviewing paperwork with Samuel Rutledge. "This is Ruby," Samuel said. "House servant, trained since childhood, literate enough to read basic instructions, obedient and quiet." Tisdale walked around Ruby in a slow circle, his assessment clinical and dehumanizing. "How old?" 9 years. Prime age for training in more complex household duties. "Any health issues, behavioral problems?" Samuel hesitated, and in that pause Ruby understood her fate was being decided. "There was an incident last year. Her mother died, and the girl made some inappropriate accusations in her grief. But she's since been corrected and has given no trouble." Tisdale's interest sharpened. "What kind of accusations?" "Nothing of consequence. A child's misunderstanding of events. She's learned better now. Children who make accusations can be problematic when they grow older," Tisdale mused. "Memories can be dangerous things. On the other hand, a well-trained house servant is valuable." He named a price that made Samuel's expression brighten with relief. Ruby felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She was being sold. After months of forced complicity, of speaking lies to preserve her life, she was being sent away anyway, shipped to Georgia where she'd likely die in cotton fields before reaching adulthood. That night, Ruby made a decision that would alter the course of several lives. She would run. Escape attempts from South Carolina plantations were common enough, though success rates were dismal. The geography worked against runaways, with swamps, rivers, and hundreds of miles separating the enslaved from free states. But Ruby was 9 years old, desperate, and had nothing left to lose. She remembered Jacob Winters's words about the Quakers on King Street in Charleston. If she could reach the city, perhaps there was hope. She confided her plan to only one person, Thomas Rutledge. It was a calculated risk. Thomas could easily betray her, but over the past months she'd observed his growing discomfort with his father's actions. The boy struggled with doubts, wrote constantly in his journal, asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. He was, Ruby sensed, someone who might still be capable of choosing conscience over convenience. She found him in the library one afternoon, supposedly studying Latin but actually writing in his journal. "Master Thomas, I need to tell you something." He looked up, startled. They rarely spoke directly anymore, the distance between their worlds having been reinforced by the previous year's events. "What is it?" "They're selling me to that Georgia man. I'm gonna run, tonight." Thomas's face went pale. "Ruby, you can't. They'll catch you. They always catch runaways. The dogs, the patrols. I'd rather die trying than die picking cotton in Georgia, but I'm telling you because—" She took a breath. "Because you've been writing about what happened to my mama. I seen you, and I think you believe me about what really happened, even if you can't say so." Thomas closed his journal protectively. "How did you know about—" "I pay attention. I see things. And I know you're a good person, Master Thomas, even if your daddy ain't. So I'm asking you to wait 3 days before you tell anyone I'm gone. Just 3 days. Give me a chance to get to Charleston. If they find out I knew and didn't tell, then say I lied to you, said I was just going to visit someone in the quarters. Say I tricked you. They'll believe that over-believing you helped me." Thomas stared at his journal, at the pages filled with his private rebellion against the system he was supposed to inherit. Ruby was asking him to transform those written doubts into action, to risk his own comfort for her slim chance at survival. 3 days, he finally whispered. "But Ruby, even if you reach Charleston, where will you go? The Quakers might help, but the city has slave catchers everywhere, and you're so young." "I'll figure something out. I have to." That night, Ruby wrapped her few possessions in a cloth bundle, a spare dress, a piece of cornbread saved from dinner, and something she'd kept hidden since her mother's death, a small wooden bird Patience had carved for her years ago. It was all she had left of the woman whose murder she'd witnessed. The house settled into sleep around midnight. Ruby slipped from her small room, moved silently through the darkened kitchen, and eased open the back door. The spring air was warm and humid, filled with the chorus of frogs from the nearby creek. She'd studied the route during her months of kitchen duties, knew which paths the patrols favored, which roads led toward Charleston. She'd made it perhaps 200 yards from the house when a voice stopped her cold. "Going somewhere, girl?" Dutch Calloway stepped from behind an outbuilding, and Ruby's heart plummeted. He'd been drinking. She could smell the whiskey even from 10 feet away, and his expression held a malice that made her stomach clench with terror. "Thought you might try something," he said, moving closer. "Been watching you, seeing that rebellious look in your eye, just like your mama had right before she died." Ruby backed away, her mind racing through impossible options. Run and he'd catch her, scream and she'd wake the house, ensuring her sail, or worse, fight, and she was 9 years old facing a grown man. "You know what happened to your mama," Calloway continued, his voice taking on a taunting quality fueled by alcohol. "You know because you saw. Samuel thinks you forgot, thinks you learned to keep quiet. But I seen the way you look at me. You remember everything." "I don't know what you're talking about," Ruby said, the rehearsed lie automatic. "Don't play stupid. You were there, watching through them barn boards. I saw your eye, saw you standing there while I—" He stopped, seeming to realize he was confessing. "While I defended myself against your mama's attack." "Please, Mr. Calloway, I was just going to the quarters to see—" "Shut up." His hand shot out and grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. "You think I'm gonna let you run off to Charleston and tell your stories? You think I'm stupid?" From the darkness, another voice spoke. "Let her go." Thomas Rutledge stepped into the moonlight, his father's hunting rifle in his hands. The boy was trembling, the weapon clearly too heavy for him, but he held it pointed in Calloway's general direction. "Master Thomas," Calloway said, his tone shifting to forced respect. "The girl was running away. I caught her just doing my job. I said let her go. You don't understand what you're doing, boy. Your father. My father watched Ruby's mother die and did nothing to stop it." The words came out in a rush, as if Thomas had been holding them in for months. "Ruby told me the truth, and I believe her. I've been watching you, Mr. Calloway. I've seen how the workers fear you. I've written it all down, everything I've seen and heard." Calloway's face darkened with rage. "You got no idea what you're talking about. What I'd done with your father's blessing. He needed order maintained, and I maintained it. He needed you to murder someone. She attacked me. Ruby was there. She saw the whole thing. My father was there too, wasn't he? That's what Ruby told me in the cellar, and that's what you're afraid people will find out." The standoff held for a long moment. 3 people frozen in the Carolina moonlight, each aware that what happened next would reshape all their futures. Finally, Calloway released Ruby's arm with a shove that sent her stumbling. "You're making a mistake, boy. A mistake that's going to cost you and your father everything." "Maybe," Thomas said, his voice steadier now. "But at least I'll be able to live with myself." Calloway stalked back toward his quarters, and Ruby knew they'd made an enemy who would never forget this moment. Thomas lowered the rifle, which hadn't even been loaded, and looked at Ruby with an expression mixing fear and exhilaration. "You need to go," he said. "Now, before he wakes my father. Head for Charleston. Find the Quakers like that man Winters said. I'll tell them you snuck away while I was sleeping. They'll come looking for you, but you'll have a head start." "Why are you helping me?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Because what happened to your mother was wrong. Because my father taught me that honorable men stand up for what's right, and then he showed me that he doesn't believe his own words. Because he struggled to articulate something beyond his years. Because if I don't help you, then I'm just as guilty as he is." Ruby wanted to thank him, to express gratitude for a kindness she'd never expected from the master's son. But there was no time. She ran into the darkness, leaving behind the only home she'd ever known, carrying nothing but a wooden bird and the memory of her mother's murder. Behind her, Thomas Rutledge returned to his room and wrote furiously in his journal, documenting everything that had just transpired, creating a record that would one day help expose the truth. And in his quarters, Dutch Calloway drank heavily and plotted revenge against a 9-year-old child who'd seen too much and a boy who'd chosen the wrong side. The events of that night would set in motion a chain reaction that would ultimately lead to the confession letter found in 1847. But Ruby's story was far from over, and the darkest revelations about what had really happened in the barn on August 14, 1834, were still to come. Ruby reached Charleston 3 days later, half-starved and exhausted, her feet bleeding from walking roads and cutting through swamps. The city overwhelmed her senses. The harbor smells of salt and fish, the cacophony of merchants hawking goods, the press of humanity in numbers she'd never imagined. She was a 9-year-old fugitive in a city full of slave catchers and patrollers, and she had no idea how to find the Quaker meeting house on King Street. For 2 days, she hid in the alleys near the docks, stealing scraps of food and sleeping in the shadows of warehouses. She saw other enslaved people on errands for their masters, but she didn't dare approach them. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. On the 3rd day, sick with hunger and desperation, she made a mistake. She tried to steal bread from a market stall, and the merchant grabbed her arm before she could run. "Got us a little thief here," he called out, and a crowd began to gather. "Who's your master, girl? Where you supposed to be?" Ruby's mind went blank with terror. In moments, someone would identify her as a runaway, and she'd be returned to Magnolia Ridge, where punishments for attempted escape were brutal and public, designed to discourage others from trying. Then a woman's voice cut through the crowd. "She belongs to my household. I've been looking everywhere for her. Thank you for catching her." The woman who stepped forward was perhaps 40 years old, plainly dressed in gray, with steel-colored hair pulled back severely. Her face was unremarkable, but her eyes held intelligence and something else, determination. The merchant looked skeptical. "You sure she's yours? Got papers?" "She's been with my family since birth. Recently lost her mother and has been troubled." The woman placed coins on the merchant's table, more than the bread was worth. "For your inconvenience and the stolen goods." The merchant took the money and released Ruby's arm. The woman's hand closed around Ruby's shoulder, firm but not painful, and guided her away from the market through twisting streets that Ruby couldn't track. They stopped finally at a modest building set back from the street, identifiable only by a simple wooden sign, Society of Friends Meeting House. "How did you know?" Ruby whispered as they entered. "Know what? That you needed help?" The woman smiled grimly. "We see many who need help. My name is Sarah Pemberton. And you, child, are going to tell me everything." Inside the meeting house, in a small room that smelled of beeswax and old books, Ruby finally broke. She told Sarah everything she'd witnessed in the barn, Dutch Calloway's violence, Samuel Rutledge's complicity, the months of enforced silence, Thomas's unexpected assistance. The words poured out in a torrent, 9 months of suppressed truth finally finding a listener who believed her. Sarah listened without interruption, her face growing grimmer with each detail. When Ruby finished, the woman was quiet for a long moment. "You've witnessed a murder, child, and you've identified the murderers, both the man who struck the blows and the man who permitted them. This is dangerous knowledge." "I know. That's why they were going to sell me to Georgia. They'll come looking for you here. Charleston isn't far enough. Even in the North, the Fugitive Slave Act means you could be captured and returned." Sarah stood and paced the small room. "But your testimony, if properly documented and protected, could be powerful, especially combined with other evidence." "What other evidence?" "There was a traveler who visited Magnolia Ridge in February, Jacob Winters. He's not really a journalist. He works with us documenting abuses for eventual publication. He suspected something was wrong at that plantation, and your behavior confirmed it for him. He's been trying to find a way to investigate further." Hope flickered in Ruby's chest. "You mean people might actually believe me?" "Some people. Not the ones who benefit from the system staying exactly as it is, but some. The problem is keeping you safe long enough to tell your story properly. Sarah made a decision. We'll send you north to Philadelphia. There are people there who can protect you and help get your testimony recorded. But first, we need one more piece of evidence. What? We need Thomas Rutledge's journal. The plan Sarah outlined was risky almost to the point of madness. She would send word to Thomas through a network of sympathetic souls, both enslaved and free, that existed throughout the South, despite all efforts to suppress it. Thomas would be asked to copy the relevant pages from his journal and send them to Charleston through the same network. Combined with Ruby's testimony, the written observations of the plantation owner's own son could provide compelling evidence of what had really happened. But what if they catch whoever carries the message? Ruby asked. What if Master Thomas refuses? What if his father finds out? Then we proceed with only your testimony, which will be worth less without corroboration. But we have to try, Ruby. What happened to your mother happens too often, in too many places, and almost always without consequences. If we can document this one case, prove that murder was committed and covered up, it might help. Well, it might help in small ways. Small ways are still worth pursuing. While Ruby waited in hiding in Philadelphia, staying with a Quaker family who'd taken in fugitives before, events at Magnolia Ridge were spiraling toward a violent confrontation. Thomas's assistance of Ruby's escape had been discovered. Dutch Calloway had woken Samuel Rutledge before dawn, explaining that the girl had run away and that Thomas had caught her but allowed her to escape, even threatening the overseer with a rifle to prevent recapture. Samuel's response was cold fury. He'd summoned Thomas to his study and demanded an explanation. The boy backed into a corner and, suddenly realizing the full weight of what he'd done, had defended his actions with all the moral certainty of youth. She was being sold to that Georgia man, and she'd die there. You know she would. And she didn't deserve any of this. Her mother didn't deserve what happened to her. Her mother attacked my overseer. That's a lie. Thomas's voice cracked with emotion. Ruby told me what really happened. She saw it all. You were there, Father. You could have stopped it, and you didn't. You chose to let Mr. Calloway kill her. The slap came fast and hard, Samuel's hand connecting with his son's face with enough force to knock the boy off his chair. It was the first time Samuel Rutledge had ever struck his child. You will never speak those words again, Samuel said, his voice shaking with rage and something else, fear. A enslaved girl told you lies, and you believed her over your own father, over Dutch Calloway, over the magistrate who investigated and found the matter lawful. Thomas, bleeding from his lip, looked up at his father with eyes that had lost something essential. She didn't lie. I know she didn't. How could you possibly know that? Because I've been watching. I've seen how Mr. Calloway treats people. I've seen the fear. And I've seen how you pretend not to notice, how you look away when it's convenient. Thomas climbed to his feet, no longer caring about consequences. I've written it all down, Father. Everything I've seen, everything Ruby told me, everything that's wrong with this place. I have pages and pages documenting it. Samuel's face went ashen. Where is this journal? Somewhere you'll never find it. The beating that followed was vicious. Samuel, driven by rage and terror at what his son's writings could mean for his reputation and legal standing, crossed a line he'd never crossed before. Margaret tried to intervene and was knocked aside. The violence only stopped when Samuel's sister physically placed herself between father and son, screaming that he would kill the boy if he didn't stop. Thomas was confined to his room, which was systematically searched for the journal. They didn't find it, because Thomas had hidden it well, inside a loose floorboard beneath his bed, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. But the search revealed something else. The card Jacob Winters had given him, with the Charleston address. Samuel now understood the full scope of the threat. His son had been in contact with abolitionists, had documented evidence of murder and cover-up, and was potentially planning to testify against his own father. Dutch Calloway offered a solution. The boy's been poisoned against you by that Winters fellow and the runaway girl. He needs to be sent away, somewhere he can be supervised and re-educated. I know a military academy in Virginia that specializes in correcting young men with rebellious attitudes. But before those plans could be implemented, the message from Sarah Pemberton arrived, carried by a free black man who worked as a carter and traveled regularly between Charleston and rural plantations. The message was coded, but Thomas understood it. Ruby was safe, and she was asking for his help. She needed copies of his journal entries about the night of Patience's death. Thomas had a choice to make: comply with his father, destroy his journal, accept that injustice was simply how the world worked, or commit fully to the rebellion he'd started, knowing it would cost him everything he'd ever known. He chose rebellion. Over 3 nights working by candlelight, Thomas copied 23 pages from his journal, detailing everything from the night Ruby came screaming into the house to his confrontation with Dutch Calloway during Ruby's escape attempt. His handwriting, still forming and childish, nevertheless captured truths that adults had worked hard to suppress. On the 4th night, he snuck from his still-locked room, having picked the simple lock with a hairpin stolen from his aunt's room, and met the carter at a pre-arranged location near the property boundary. He handed over the copied pages wrapped in canvas and whispered a message to be delivered to Ruby. "Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't do more. Tell her I believe her." The carter disappeared into the darkness, and Thomas returned to his room, knowing that what he'd just done was irrevocable. There would be consequences, potentially severe ones, but he'd made his choice. What Thomas didn't know was that Dutch Calloway had suspected something and had been watching the house. The overseer saw Thomas meet the carter, saw the package exchange hands, and smiled grimly to himself. The boy had just provided evidence of conspiracy with abolitionists. It was exactly the excuse Calloway needed to convince Samuel Rutledge that more drastic measures were required. The next morning, Thomas was woken before dawn by his father and 2 men he didn't recognize, hired muscle from Charleston. They searched his room and found the journal hidden beneath the floorboards. Samuel read the entries with a face like carved stone, and when he finished, he looked at his son with an expression that held no love, only cold calculation. "You've betrayed your family, your class, your people. I told the truth. Your truth is treason." Samuel handed the journal to Dutch Calloway. "Burn it, all of it." "No." Thomas lunged for the journal, but the hired men restrained him easily. Calloway took the journal outside, and they heard the crackle of flames as months of Thomas's careful documentation went up in smoke. But the overseer had made a critical error. The copied pages, the ones Thomas had sent to Charleston, survived. They would reach Ruby in Philadelphia 2 weeks later, and eventually become part of the confession letter that would be found in 1847. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Charleston intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Thomas Rutledge was sent to Braxton Military Academy in Virginia the following week, a harsh institution known for breaking the spirits of rebellious young men. His father hoped the academy would erase his son's dangerous sympathies and transform him into a proper Southern gentleman. At Magnolia Ridge, with both Thomas and Ruby gone, Dutch Calloway's reign became even more brutal. Without the master's son watching and documenting abuses, the overseer felt free to exercise his worst impulses. 2 more enslaved people died under suspicious circumstances that summer. Samuel Rutledge, consumed by paranoia about what testimony might be spreading in abolitionist circles, withdrew increasingly into drink and isolation. Margaret Rutledge, watching her brother's descent and remembering the violence she'd witnessed between Samuel and Thomas, began to question her own complicity in the events that had destroyed their family. She started her own journal, writing in secret about her doubts, her guilt, and her growing realization that the system she'd defended all her life was fundamentally evil. In Philadelphia, Ruby was learning to read and write properly, taught by the Quaker family sheltering her. She was receiving treatment for the trauma she'd endured, though nightmares about the barn still woke her screaming. When Thomas's copied pages arrived, she wept to see his childish handwriting documenting belief in her story. Proof that someone from the world of masters had chosen truth over convenience. Sarah Pemberton and Jacob Winters, working with other abolitionists, began compiling Ruby's testimony, Thomas's journal excerpts, and other evidence they'd gathered about Magnolia Ridge into a document they hoped might eventually be published or used in legal proceedings. But they underestimated Dutch Calloway's determination to protect himself. The overseer had connections throughout South Carolina, including with slave catchers who made their living hunting fugitives. He put out word that a substantial reward was offered for the return of Ruby Drummond, emphasizing that she was dangerous, a liar spreading falsehoods about respectable white men. The reward was significant enough to tempt even those who might otherwise look the other way. In September 1835, one of these slave catchers, a man named Silas Crenshaw, received information about a young black girl matching Ruby's description living with Quakers in Philadelphia. The Fugitive Slave Act gave him legal right to operate in northern states, and despite the protection the Quakers tried to provide, Crenshaw was skilled at his brutal profession. He came for Ruby on a Tuesday night, breaking into the Quaker household with forged paperwork and 2 hired thugs. The family tried to resist, but they were pacifists who'd never prepared for violence. Ruby was dragged from her bed, bound, and loaded into a wagon for the journey back to South Carolina. The return trip took 6 days. Ruby, terrified and gagged, understood she was being taken back to face a punishment that would likely end in her death. She'd humiliated Samuel Rutledge, cost him his relationship with his son, and threatened to expose a murder. There would be no mercy. But Crenshaw made a mistake. He chose a route that passed through Virginia, and he stopped for the night at a tavern in Richmond. While the slave catcher drank inside, Ruby, locked in the wagon, managed to work her hands free from the ropes. She kicked at the wagon's back gate until it splintered, and she ran into the Richmond night. By chance or providence, she stumbled into the grounds of Braxton Military Academy. The military academy sat on 20 acres of Virginia woodland, its main building a stern brick structure that looked more like a prison than a school. Ruby, bleeding from her escape and delirious with fear, collapsed near the stables where a groom found her the next morning. Thomas Rutledge, now 10 years old and hardened by 6 months at Braxton, was working stable duty as punishment for insubordination when the groom brought the unconscious girl to the infirmary. He recognized her immediately. "Ruby?" He pushed past the academy nurse to kneel beside the cot where she lay. "Ruby, what happened?" She woke to his voice, and for a moment couldn't believe she was seeing him. "Master Thomas, how are you? My father sent me here after I gave your testimony to the abolitionists. Ruby, why are you in Virginia? You were supposed to be safe in Philadelphia." Through cracked lips and tears, Ruby explained about the slave catcher, the capture, the escape. "They're coming for me. That man, Crenshaw, he's going to realize I'm gone and he'll search everywhere. I don't have anywhere else to run." Thomas's face set with determination. "Then we don't run. We fight back. We tell everyone what really happened, and we use my position here to make them listen. They won't believe me. They never believe enslaved people. Maybe not in South Carolina with my father's influence, but here, this is Virginia. And the commandant of this academy is a Union Army veteran who doesn't like plantation owners. I've heard him say things, critical things about the system. It's worth trying." Over Ruby's protests, Thomas went directly to Commandant Marcus Wellesley, a severe man of 53 who ran Braxton Academy with military precision. Thomas knocked on the commandant's office door and, when admitted, spoke with all the courage he'd accumulated over the past brutal months. "Sir, there's a fugitive enslaved girl in our infirmary. Her name is Ruby Drummond, and she witnessed a murder on my father's plantation. I have documentation of that murder, testimony that I personally recorded and sent to abolitionists in Philadelphia. She's being hunted by a slave catcher named Silas Crenshaw, who intends to return her to South Carolina, where she'll likely be killed to prevent her testimony. Sir, I know the law is on the slave catcher's side, but the moral right is on hers. I'm asking you to protect her. Wellesley studied the boy in front of him. Thomas Rutledge had arrived at Braxton 6 months earlier with a reputation as a troublemaker, but Wellesley had seen something different. A young man with principles that had gotten him in trouble with his father. The commandant had served in the military during the War of 1812, had seen enough cruelty and injustice to make him skeptical of Southern claims of benevolent slavery. You're asking me to defy the Fugitive Slave Act. I'm asking you to prevent a murder, sir. Wellesley made a decision that would alter the trajectory of several lives. Bring me this documentation you mentioned. I want to see what evidence you have. Thomas didn't have the original journal, which had been burned, but he had something better. He'd memorized large portions of it, and over the next 3 hours, he recreated key passages for Commandant Wellesley, describing in detail what Ruby had witnessed, what he'd observed at Magnolia Ridge, and the conspiracy of silence that had protected the guilty. Ruby, recovered enough to speak, provided her own testimony, describing the night in the barn with a clarity that left no doubt about her truthfulness. When Silas Crenshaw arrived at the academy the next day with his forged papers and legal authority to reclaim his property, he found not cooperation but resistance. Commandant Wellesley, backed by 6 armed academy instructors, refused to turn over Ruby. Your papers may be in order, Mr. Crenshaw, but I have reason to believe this child is a material witness to a murder. I'm detaining her pending investigation by Virginia authorities. You're welcome to petition the Richmond court if you disagree. Crenshaw sputtered about the law, about property rights, about the trouble he'd bring down on Braxton Academy. But Wellesley, who'd faced down enemy soldiers in battle, was unmoved. The slave catcher left empty-handed, though he promised to return with court orders and legal muscle. Over the following weeks, Commandant Wellesley used his military connections to bring attention to Ruby's case. He contacted Union Army officers with abolitionist sympathies, wrote to newspapers in Richmond and Washington, and ensured that Ruby's testimony and Thomas's corroborating account were documented by multiple witnesses. The pressure forced Virginia authorities to open an investigation into the events at Magnolia Ridge. Judge Pritchard's cursory 1834 ruling was examined and found wanting. New testimony was taken from enslaved workers at Magnolia Ridge, who, sensing possible protection from Virginia investigators, began speaking more openly about Dutch Calloway's brutality and Samuel Rutledge's complicity. Margaret Rutledge, summoned to give testimony, surprised everyone by producing her own journal. In it, she documented her growing doubts about what had happened to Patience Drummond, conversations she'd overheard between her brother and the overseer, and her own complicity in maintaining the false narrative. Her testimony was damning. I knew the official account didn't align with what I'd observed of Patience's character. I knew Ruby's initial accusations deserved investigation rather than suppression, but I chose to protect my brother and maintain our social position. In doing so, I became complicit in covering up a murder. The investigation revealed other truths about Magnolia Ridge. Financial records showed Samuel Rutledge had been deeply in debt, desperate to maintain his plantation's productivity at any cost. Correspondence between Rutledge and Dutch Calloway documented a pattern of escalating violence, with the overseer essentially given free rein to control the enslaved workforce by whatever means he deemed necessary. Most damning of all, when authorities examined the barn where Patience had died, they found evidence that contradicted the official story. The pitchfork that had supposedly been used to attack Calloway showed no signs of Patience's touch, no blood or tissue that would confirm she'd wielded it as a weapon. The blood pattern on the barn floor suggested a one-sided beating, not a mutual struggle. Clara's observation to Ruby years earlier was vindicated. The pitchfork had been placed near Patience's right hand, but she'd been left-handed. It was a small detail, but one that revealed the hasty staging of a crime scene. Dutch Calloway, sensing the investigation closing in, attempted to flee South Carolina. He made it as far as Alabama before being apprehended by federal marshals. Samuel Rutledge, facing potential murder charges, suffered what his doctors called an apoplectic seizure, though many suspected he'd simply collapsed under the weight of his guilt and fear. In February 1836, Ruby Drummond and Thomas Rutledge sat together in a Richmond courthouse and provided formal testimony about what had happened on August 14, 1834. Ruby, now 10 years old, spoke clearly about witnessing her mother's murder. Thomas, also 10, corroborated her account and provided context about the plantation's atmosphere of violence and fear. The legal proceedings were complicated by jurisdictional issues and the fact that the crime had occurred in South Carolina, where local authorities were still inclined to protect Samuel Rutledge. But the publicity generated by the case, amplified by abolitionist newspapers in the North, created pressure that couldn't be ignored. Dutch Calloway was eventually tried not for murder, but for manslaughter, a compromise verdict that satisfied no one but was seen as the best achievable outcome. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison, of which he served 4 before dying of pneumonia in a Georgia penitentiary. Samuel Rutledge never faced criminal charges, but the social consequences were severe. His reputation destroyed, his debts overwhelming, and his health shattered. He sold Magnolia Ridge in 1837 and died a broken man 2 years later. Margaret Rutledge used a portion of the plantation's sale proceeds to purchase Ruby's freedom, legally manumitting her in a document filed with the Charleston court. It was a small act of atonement for years of complicity, but one that Ruby accepted with complicated gratitude. Thomas Rutledge completed his education at Braxton Academy and later attended university in Pennsylvania, where he became involved in the abolitionist movement. He and Ruby maintained correspondence for years, 2 people whose childhood trauma had bound them together in unexpected ways. But the story had one final chapter, one that explained how the confession letter came to be found in the walls of the demolished plantation manor in 1847. In 1846, Ruby Drummond, now 20 years old and living in Philadelphia as a free woman, received word that Magnolia Ridge was being demolished. The plantation had changed hands twice since Samuel Rutledge's death, and the current owner was razing the manor house to build a more modern structure. Ruby traveled to South Carolina, her first return since escaping 12 years earlier. She brought with her something she'd been working on for months, a complete account of her mother's murder, combining her testimony, Thomas's journal excerpts, and Margaret Rutledge's confessional writings. She titled it simply, "The True Account of Patience Drummond's Death." Thomas, now 21 and studying law, met her at the ruins of Magnolia Ridge. Together they stood before the barn where everything had begun, now weathered and leaning, scheduled for demolition. "We should leave a record," Thomas said. "Something that can't be easily destroyed or dismissed. The legal case is closed, but the truth deserves to be preserved." They created what would become known as the confession letter. Ruby's testimony in her adult handwriting, followed by Thomas's childhood journal excerpts in his preserved childish script. 2 voices, 2 perspectives, 1 truth. They sealed the document in oilcloth and hid it inside the manor's wall during the demolition, hoping someday it would be found and believed. When workers discovered it in 1847, the Charleston Historical Society initially tried to suppress it, just as authorities had tried to suppress the original testimony. But copies had been made, and the story spread through abolitionist networks, becoming one more piece of evidence in the growing national argument over slavery's fundamental evil. Ruby Drummond lived to see the Civil War end slavery, dying in 1891 at age 65, surrounded by the children and grandchildren her mother never got to meet. Thomas Rutledge became a lawyer who specialized in defending formerly enslaved people in legal disputes, spending his career trying to atone for his father's sins. The barn where Patience died was torn down in 1848. Local legend claimed the ground there never grew anything properly afterward, though more likely it was just poor soil. Margaret Rutledge spent her final years operating a school for freed black children in Charleston, her own form of penance. This mystery shows us that truth, even when buried by power and protected by law, has a way of surviving. Patience. Drummond's murder was legal under the system that existed in 1834, but it was never just. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets in South Carolina's soil? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkest chapters of history deserve to be remembered, not forgotten. See you in the next video.